So thanks
Thank
again.
You. It's nice to be here, Sam.
Good to be here.
Thanks. So before we get the conversation started, I'm sure we all would love to learn a little bit more about each of you and your background. So if you could each tell us a little bit about yourself, that'd be great. Kevin, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Sure. I'm a professor of history at Ohio University. My focus is usually on the intersection between culture and politics. I'm interested predominantly in contemporary history that's, not in the far distant past, but something that, it comes closer to our own times. And I also believe adamantly that history can inform our understanding of the present.
And I have a background in cultural studies. My historical interest is in aging and technology. But since I have started the social media program here at Ohio University, I know about many things social media. That's what I do.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And I know the idea of politics being entertainment isn't necessarily a new idea. So Kevin, we're really excited to hear kind of about the way that has formed throughout the years. And I feel like the idea of social media being a part of and impacting politics is, kind of relatively newer, especially since social media has really expanded only in the last few elections. I remember back in 2008 when I was definitely not even able to vote, but it was just getting on social media, feeling like I didn't see anything about the election, or at least not much like you do today. Mm-hmm. So I think having both of your expertise and backgrounds in your respected areas is going to shed really great light on this topic tonight. So again, cool. Thank you so much for being here, especially on a Monday night. Now to a reminder of course. Now, a reminder to our viewers that if you have a question that you'd like to ask these experts, please feel free to message one of our Ohio University social media accounts or comment on the live stream. We'll be sure to do our best to get to all of your questions tonight, and if we cannot, we will be sure that they get answered by these experts, and we will give you the answers that they send back to us either through a direct message or on the comment as well. So without further ado, let's get our conversation started, huh? How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right, great. Well, Kevin, you are the history expert here. And like you said, history is a great way to learn more about the present time. So my first question will be for you. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of entertainment dominating so much political activity, and if there's any historical figures who've seemed to, build their reputation by crossing that line between entertainment and serious discussion?
That's a great question. I think that I always point it out to my students that P.T. Barnum, who was the inventor of the original circus and the idea of humbug, with this idea that people, especially Americans, seem to like being lied to, and that they enjoy and revel in being lied to, that he was also a politician. I think he kept the spheres kind of distant from one another, but it's this kind of joining together of entertainment and politics has been around for, I think, quite some time. I don't think it's something that just erupted overnight recently. Although I would say that I think that the place where you can spot this kind of conflation of entertainment with politics, I would say it goes back to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who predominantly got his background out of the culture industry, both Hollywood and radio announcing and opening up for GE Theater during the 1950s. That was the basis on which he then made his move into politics. And I think that's where you start to see this sort of syncing together of entertainment and politics that is still with us today.
Great. Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting that you bring up P.T. Barnum, because I know, there's been multiple different forms of entertainment that surround, about him. We've got The Greatest Showman and everything else, and it doesn't necessarily paint that picture of the man who he really was. It's more of this entertaining, joyous occasion when you're seeing this. So that's really interesting. And I know before that Ronald Reagan had that title, that entertainer in chief, as given to him. So it's very interesting that you bring that up as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was said about Reagan by his press spokesperson that if you said something 5 times, it was necessarily true.
We'll see if we can hold that one to any more nowadays, All right, well, we'll go on to, maybe something more relevant today. We've got a little bit of history from Kevin, but this one's for you, Karen, that is dealing with something that is extremely prevalent in today's culture, memes. Memes are playing a major role in increasingly politically polarized social media environment. So can you talk about some of the factors that are shaping this trend?
I can, but I would say also that Ronald Reagan is never irrelevant.
That is true.
I think, Kevin, you could probably have a whole other panel discussion about that and think about today. But yeah, memes are extremely important. We think of them as like silly little low production value cartoons, but they are part of an inside language that people use. They know that they're part of an in-group when they receive a meme on their social media feeds. They are going to be coming from people who speak the same language that they do. And likely what's going to happen is in a time when political discourse has been dumbed down to the point where we can communicate in just these little bulletin boards of bad graphics with easily manipulated image macros and headlines, typeface. It's good to know that we're able to get our thoughts across to other people. And I'm afraid that what that means sometimes is these thoughts aren't very well developed. Sometimes they are, but you know what you had said a moment ago about if you say something 5 times, it must be true, Kevin. I think when you see a meme 5 times, or you see a message that comes through in different memes 5 times, it has that resonance. It begins to be true. And unfortunately, that's how social media works on the internet. You have that ring of resonance, that ring of truth that occurs because people keep hearing the same thing in very small doses over and over again. And memes are very shareable. They're things that we receive and we think are funny, so we share them. And that gives us a certain social capital when we do that, because we look extra cool or extra hip or extra smart or whatever we happen to be. But memes of a political nature are not necessarily innocent. Sometimes they're adjacent to campaigns. And so the way that our president has, for example, used memes is he will maybe retweet something, or more likely his son will retweet something. I don't know if you remember this, but when he was running for his first election, the alt-right was extremely influential at that time. And they had co-opted a meme called Pepe the Frog. Pepe was somebody that everybody loved and adored, who was a millennial. And he was innocent. He was just a lazy bro type. And all the funny things that got said in connection with Pepe, people would just modify these image macros and share them, and they were very, very funny. But at some point, he became compromised because he was caught up in the sort of campaign of the alt-right to back Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, Donald Trump as president, for president. And this really infuriated the comic creator who made Pepe for his own comic strip on the internet, who ultimately did kill him off. But not before, there was one in particular, there was one meme in particular called the Deplorables. So that it was a takeoff on a movie poster of a movie that was popular at the time, a superhero movie called The Expendables. And all these different, Donald Trump was in the middle, and all these other, Roger Stone, Mike Pence, Donald Trump Jr., Alex Jones, all the greats were in this, their heads were put into this meme. And Pepe was one of these people. And Donald Trump Jr. retweeted the meme and endorsed it. So that got a lot of flack from the left, but the alt-right loved it. because they had propagated the meme in the first place. And so it looked as if it was an endorsement of the alt-right agenda. So it's not the last time we saw something like that associated with the president or his campaign.
Didn't he recently retweet, which is a new word for me to use, retweet something from QAnon in the last go round? Yeah. So, I mean, that's when you start. I mean, I think that some of what we're dealing with here is how conspiracy theories are entertaining for people because they give this kind of macro explanation of things. And I think that it doesn't surprise. And his defense was like, I just retweeted it. I didn't tweet it. Right. And also he's against pedophiles, which is helpful, to learn. But so, yeah, I mean, that was, I think, I remember that. And I remember, and now that you're talking about the earlier rendition of that, yeah, it's still clear in my mind.
Well, that's what I mean by campaign adjacent.
Yes.
One of Trump's tropes is being able to retweet something or reference something and to be able to acknowledge it without being the person who said it in the first place. And because social media is so ripe for entertainment, there's so much there to deal with. And we have here a man who is an entertainer by profession.
Yeah.
One of his tricks that he has in his bag is as an entertainer. So he's able to share these things. And Donald Trump Jr., when he retweeted the Deplorables meme, he was able to say the next day to The Hill, oh, well, I hadn't heard of Pepe before. I just thought it was a cute cartoon. So when you retweet something, it's easy to wash your hands of it, but you've already done the damage.
Right. Right. Yeah. What's that statement that the amount of time it takes for a lie to go across the face of the earth, the truth is only just getting its boots on. I mean, I think that's what, the rapidity at which this stuff works and how things suddenly overnight become true, even though they aren't true.
And that's why, and I don't mean to steal anything you might be getting at, Sam, but that's why fake news spreads so fast. It's salacious in some way, and it's much more fun to gossip about things that could be salacious than it is to deal with the unpacking of the old boring truth. So these things that catch our ear, QAnon in particular, this is a conspiracy theory that comes out of a group of people who claim that that Hillary Clinton is at the head of a ring of pedophiles, who are out to ruin Donald Trump and those kinds of things. When you hear it on the face of it, it's ridiculous to think that anyone would take that seriously. But because we see it repeatedly so many times, and in our particular friend groups, we might see the same people whom we know and trust posting it so many times in so many different ways that it begins to develop a certain resonance.
Yeah, what would be a fun project for a graduate student or a professor to work on would be the change in the art of conspiracy theory. Because I mean, if you go back to I think the one that's most present in a lot of people's minds, which is the assassination of JFK, and then all the different explanations. What you notice then is that there's a kind of pluralism to the explanations, right? And there's certainly holes in the facts of the original report saying that he was shot by a lone gun person. But, when you think about how, it was, there's people who say, well, it was probably something dealing with Castro and anti-Castro activists, or it could have something to do with, there were multitudes of conspiracy theories. Now it seems to be that there's just a few, but they just keep getting repeated and repeated and repeated over again, that they just seem to stick in a way that I don't think conspiracy theories in the past, maybe people were more creative with their conspiracy theories or something like that. But it definitely has changed. And conspiracy theory, I think, is one of those places where people really love that stuff. And I think some of them even know it's wrong and false, and they still love it. And that's something that's a hard nut to crack if you really want to, try to encourage people to deliberate and participate in politics.
I think a lot of it has to do, Kevin, with social capital. We are sharing these things with our friend groups, the in-group that we are part of, and they are acknowledging us for it. And when they repeat what we said, that imbues us with greater social capital as well. The more spreadable something is, the more true it becomes.
Right, disprovable in some ways, right? Yeah, mm-hmm. I agree with that. That makes sense.
Yeah, and memes are something that are so simple, and fake news generally is something so simple that it's impossible, almost impossible to disprove.
Yeah,
it's much easier to repeat than it is to disprove, and the language is going to be so incendiary that for a reasonable person to take issue with it, you'd have to be comparatively boring.
Yeah, you bring up great points. I mean, thinking about this idea of the social capital, not like I've necessarily shared anything like that on my own personal social media platforms, but, it's like the idea of, sharing something for your friends and gaining this like and how good it feels mm-hmm. to have that like or have someone else share what you share is a really great point. And kind of going along with this conversation that we've had, we actually have our first Facebook user who's asking a question related, and you might have already answered part of this question, but there's a second part. So I'll go ahead and ask all of it, and you can answer what you have or haven't already. But from Kevin on Facebook, not Kevin here, mm-hmm. he asked, how do these conspiracy theories spread, and what can we do to mitigate the disinformation in these spreads?
Kevin, you want to start?
No, I guess I will have to admit here that I'm a pessimist when it comes to these questions, and I think it's a little bit too late. I think the genie's been let out of the bottle, and I think the idea that you can just push it back in is pretty naive. So, I mean, I hate to tell the listener this, but I'm not terribly optimistic about doing this, and it feels to me that we've crossed a number of lines in terms of understanding the truth. And once the term alternative facts was created, I just thought, okay, that's it. There's no capacity to push back on this stuff. You have to believe in some form of the enlightenment, that you can enlighten yourself about the truths that stare you in the face or don't, or cloaked. And I think we've lost that. And I think we see public discussion now more being about people feeling good about themselves. I mean, Sam, you brought that up, and I think, it's the mm-hmm. rush of endorphins that many people will claim that they get when they hear that they got a thumbs up or a like or whatever it is. But I hate to tell people this, but I think it's probably a little bit too late. Maybe Karen has a more optimistic take on this, but for me, I think, like I said, I think the genie's out of the bottle, and I don't think we can shove it back in.
Well, optimism wasn't at all what I was going to come back with. Yeah. I'm sorry. But, let me just take two parts of that. First, when we talk about the feeling good part, the endorphin part, there's this concern that our culture has gotten to the point where we are emotionally dumbed down, because now we are so dependent on the little boost to our self-esteem. The self-esteem itself has become more important to us, and that we are becoming increasingly narcissistic as a society because our capital relies upon the approval we get from our social media audience, which is a sad thing. Sorry, but that's, I think it plays into all of this. Mm-hmm. In terms of conspiracy theory and, the genie being let out of the bottle, social media has something called a power law that suggests that what you have to do is get your message out to a few influential people who have followings. And once you do, it becomes very powerful. So someone like, for example, Alex Jones, you don't have to get everybody on board, but if you get Alex Jones on board with your conspiracy theory, you've got somebody with a megaphone right there. And unfortunately, that means that news is going to travel quickly. Unfortunately, we can say this. We can say, okay, from birth to what's that other thing? Cradle to grave. We have to have digital media literacy. We have to teach everybody to be thinking for themselves, to understand what a credible source is, and all these things. That would go a long way toward quelling conspiracy theory, fake news, and the like. You can learn to recognize what a fake website looks like compared to one that is credible. But it's also true, what Kevin is saying, the genie is out of the bottle. Artificial intelligence, bots, and troll farms, we can't really underestimate the amount of influence these things had on the last presidential election cycle. Not to mention on this one, because these things are simply not known. The whole story is never known. Electoral politics has become so complex that we can't single out, oh, well, Donald Trump won because Cambridge Analytica was working with Putin to make sure that he got elected, to make sure that all the people on Facebook believed that he was the correct candidate. That's true and it's not true. All these things, they're true and they're not true. Truth no longer is the thing that we realized, this Enlightenment concept that Kevin's referring to. We no longer have a truth that we can depend on because there's so many authorities, so many voices just shouting out there.
Yeah, I personally don't believe that there is a capital T truth. I'll admit to that. But, I guess as I see more and more where someone can basically make an argument against a scientist whose background is much deeper than the person complaining. And I think we all know what I'm talking about. That's where I'm back to the idea that it's very difficult to know how someone like a Fauci responds, right? Because if he defends himself, people will automatically say, well, he's being disobedient to the president, and that's not good. If he doesn't disavow it, then the conspiracy theories will be out there circulating with nobody checking them. I remember I had this very weird experience teaching at OU. I taught a class where we discussed the rise of Marilyn Monroe to stardom and celebrity in 1950s. And I had a student who sent to me, and this is to your civic, I think, what you call, online literacy, which I think is a great idea. I'm probably a little bit less hopeful about it, but nonetheless, I had this student send me this report about how there was a guy who worked for the FBI, I think it was, who had killed Marilyn Monroe and had secretly gotten away with it. And there was even a photograph of him, this guy dead. And I remember going up to the top address and I did a backspace, and it was World Weekly News. If anybody remembers that was the one with Bat Boy and just like flagrant falsehoods that, were, again, precisely because they were entertaining. It was a tabloid. And I said to my student, I said, you really shouldn't do this because the people aren't going to take you seriously when you make other claims that are supposedly to the truth. So, I mean, I think there's maybe some ways to build those literacy programs. I wonder how much people feel the way that you do, that they're something that they would get behind. I don't know.
I think, again, it's a partial answer to a big problem. I do think that we're fools not to practice digital literacy education. But again, I don't think that there's a panacea there. I think there's a limit to whatever we can do, but that's no reason not to do it.
Yeah, I agree.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, I can think back to that one, it was just a quirky story, but I mean, how embarrassed this young woman was by having being caught, basically circulating things that were just completely nonsense. I hope. I don't know. I guess maybe I should, track her down and say, have you ever spread another, rumor that's just not, or conspiracy theory that's not true? But I mean, I think that there's some element that at least some people have, which is, kind of a feeling of shame when it comes to, what they might have once believed. And being able to throw that behind is probably, kind of an act of liberation for some people. But I'm still skeptical as to how many people are willing to do such a thing.
It's really hard to let go of something that you've trumpeted.
Yeah.
Because you've staked your reputation on it.
Yeah.
Right? You've actually gotten capital for it. You've bet on it. And for you to be able to say, okay, this thing I was so loud about, I was wrong. And I agree with you about capital T truth and small t truth. I think epistemologically, we all have our point of view, and that's why we have politics. Mm-hmm. That's why we have conversations about politics. But you ought to be able to have facts, which are not necessarily the same as truth. But when Kellyanne Conway was talking about alternative facts, she was talking about something that should have been provably true.
Yeah.
Right.
So I would say we actually are getting a lot of Facebook questions. So this is great. And actually received this question before you started talking about literacy. So part of the question from Theodore on Facebook is if you can talk about the importance of social media literacy, which I think you covered pretty well. But the follow-up to that is specifically for you, Karen, how do you include that in your social media teaching curriculum here at Ohio University? Teaching students how to find the social media literacy and find, the facts in it and not share misinformation.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing that too. Got something to learn.
Just all, Karen.
No pressure. So we have a class actually that's it's called Introduction to Social Media. And one of the things we talk about in there is how to understand credibility. And, it's not very different from a normal journalism class in that regard. You ought to be able to find out what's true and what's not true in terms of fact. But when we're talking about the World Wide Web, we're looking at phenomena that can take on the look of credibility, even though they might be, somebody sitting in their basement in Macedonia cranking out ideas that are faked in order to promote something that didn't really happen. But lots of times it's easy to see, for example, that a website has a lot of misspellings, a lot of English type language in it that might be promoting something that's really alternative, that's really nefarious, and is coming from a troll farm somewhere.
A lot of Google translations, right? Those Google translations where it just doesn't sound like it's really someone who has a command of the English language.
Syntax is all screwed up.
Yeah.
But you can also look at web addresses. For example, I recommend that you not go to whitehouse.com because it is a porn site.
I did that. I did that in the 1990s. And my wife and I remember that. Yeah, I was working at a place where we were working on public service projects, and I was like, I bet that the White House site has, good statistics on this. And I remember this person over my shoulder. I typed it in. I'm like, oh my God, and I think that they actually tagged me and would send promotional stuff, and I was God, I was totally mortified. I was like, I should have put in the gov, but I put in the com.
Note to self, not whitehouse.com.
Don't do it. Sorry, I cut you off. But
twice as entertaining as anything I would have said.
Personal experience sometimes.
And but look at Wikipedia, okay, and that is kind of a setup comment. Wikipedia itself actually is not nearly as riddled with untruths as you think it might be. But the point is Wikipedia has a nice article that has a list of fake news websites. And if you go there and look at some of these websites, you'll see that they have a point of view. Everybody has a point of view. I don't tend to believe in objectivity any more than Kevin believes in truth, in those terms. But fake news websites have an axe to grind. They have a reason for being that has something it wants to introduce into the political discourse. So yeah, we talk about that in social media intro, how to tell what might be fake from what might be real. I recommend everybody learn how. But the problem is that next week you'll need to learn again.
Oh, right. Right.
Yeah.
Do you actually compile a list of trustworthy websites that delve into politics?
No.
No?
I'd love to, but no, I mean, I do teach my students more in terms of here's how to find, as opposed to here's what they are, because they're constantly changing. You never know when Breitbart might buy something.
That's true. And so kind of going along with that, we've like I said, we've got tons of questions from social media on for you two. So kind of going along with that, Dennis on Facebook is asking, how do we confirm the credibility of these fact checkers on social media and online in general? I know when I'm scrolling personally through my Facebook feed and I'm reading articles, it'll say, at the bottom now, like, this has been fact checked, or this, has false information. So how do we trust and know that those people who are putting that on there, that's believable?
Yeah, I think that's a question for you, Karen.
It's a black box, isn't it? Because we know that Facebook and Twitter have come forth trying to do more of this, trying to do some fact checking, at least doing some censoring or some marking of posts. But what we don't tend to know is who's doing the fact checking. The best thing that you can do, I think, and this is what is the problem, is it takes too much time for people to do this stuff, is to try and find multiple sources. So if Facebook has told you something isn't true, well, it very likely isn't true, because we have to believe that the integrity of their fact-checking process must be credible, but we can't assume that it is. In order to find out whether something is factual, you have to be your own fact checker. You have to look for multiple sources and look for those sources that you can trust. Like Kevin was talking about, how about those reliable political sources?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's, I know, fact checking, like you said, takes a lot of time, but if you really want to know, what, like you said, the truth, whether it's capital T or not, but at least what's aligning to be the facts, it does take time and a lot of different resources. Kevin, did you have some? Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but if we've taught people to enjoy themselves with 20-second TikToks, we've put our culture into a place now where we have told you it's even less interesting to fact check than it might have been 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, no, and the only thing that I can think about in this context is what my personal practices are, and I just limit the number of sites that I go to that offer news. I go to ones that I find trustworthy, and I very rarely am dissatisfied. So I check Talking Points Memo every day. I check Washington Post, sometimes New York Times, and I feel like they can get things wrong, no doubt about it. They've screwed up themselves, but it just makes me feel more, or maybe I should say less likely, that there will be an appeal based upon some sort of conspiracy theory or some bot or something like that out there. And knowing them well enough, I think if they do get, hacked or something like that, I'd be able to probably quickly be able to tell that.
Sure, you could. And even when they quote anonymous sources, we know that they have multiple sources because that's their policy. Right.
So another question we have from Facebook, it's from Amal. it's talking more on the virtual war and global side of this. So Amal asks, I know you're talking about how social media can impact a political campaign. Last week in my global media politics class, we discussed cyber revolution and virtual war. Do you believe with external influence, these political campaigns become a virtual war? I'm all asking the tough questions.
Kevin?
Yeah, I say I have one word, yes. Not much more than
Absolutely.
that, you know. Yeah, I think that this terrifies me. I mean, because I think that this coming election has got so many threads where things could go so terribly wrong, and we could get a really inaccurate measurement of what the vote out there is. So you add in the foreign cyber attacks and stuff like that, and what we now know is supposedly Russia's obviously engaged. Seemingly China might be engaged. Seemingly Iran might be engaged. The more that becomes a possibility, the less certain I think people are going to feel about the fairness of elections. And that to me is like the biggest, most worrisome thing, is that we can be doing some serious, long-standing damage to our democracy and to regular citizens' abilities to feel faith or some sort of trust, not mindless trust, but some sort of trust in public institutions. And I think we're heading for that in this coming election. Now, my only hope is that it doesn't get as bad as it sounds like it's already getting. But I mean, especially if you put that on top of some of the questions about mail-in voting and all the things, and how the president has called all of this into question, it makes me very, very nervous that our upcoming election is not going to be fair, I guess is the easiest word to use.
Well, and we see that in social media now, don't we? The QAnon movement is placing a great deal of emphasis on the unfairness of the mail-in voting system and the corruptness of it. I think all these things are just going to continue to collapse onto themselves and convince our public, our electorate, that we don't have a democracy. Mm-hmm. I think the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Iranian government, they're very interested in disruption. I think what we see in the Russian government want as much as anything is just a lack of trust in the system itself. Sure, they didn't want to see Hillary Clinton become president for a variety of reasons. But what trolls do is trolls want to disrupt. That's why trolls are.
Yeah.
And to be able to find social media as an environment where the democratic process can be disrupted, and it's so easily so, it's certainly, we are ripe for that opportunity over and over again. But I think your student I think it was a student actually, who weighed in there, Sam, I think this is a person who's interested in global politics, from the impression that I had, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we do a lot of belly gazing here in the States, looking at social media is us, because that's the American way. But as Kevin's pointing out, people are looking from the outside to engage with American politics. As well, they're looking from the outside to engage in outside politics. Cambridge Analytica was not just the company that disrupted the U.S. presidential election in 2016, but also was heavily involved in Brexit, in regime changes in places like Kenya and Nigeria and Venezuela. So we get the feeling, or we get this sort of impression, that everything that's happening is happening right here to me in my little world. But it's not. It's a great big world, and things are happening everywhere. The storms are all over, and the storms are all connected.
Yeah, thank you both. One, that was a great question. I definitely think something that I personally haven't thought of, and I'm glad you both were able to weigh in and give some clarification and I'll look into that. Like I said, we've got even more questions coming at both of you. So this one is coming from Taylor on Twitter, and it's going back to the idea of social capital. So Taylor says, per the social capital discussion, what role historically and currently do we see thought leaders playing? Should we begin by proactively insulating those people or the public from conspiracies in the future?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I understand that either.
Let me see. Well, here, I'll ask the first part of the question and then see if I can decipher the second part again.
Okay.
So the first part was, per the social capital discussion, what role historically and currently do we see thought leaders playing?
Okay. I can deal with part of that, Kevin,
Yeah,
if you want to.
please do.
Okay. So the idea of social capital in this sense, in social media, what we want is if we're looking to push an agenda, what we want is for those thought leaders, those people who are going to be able to get out front of a message and influence their own followers to share. So that power law of social media, we want those influential people to share our message and get it out to the masses so that the people who look to them are going to be convinced, not by us and our voices, but we want their social capital to be able to magnify a message that we have for them. Again, so if you look at Alex Jones as, the straw man that I'm using here, if we convince Alex Jones of our conspiracy theory, Alex Jones has a bully pulpit that he uses to be able to bring along his followers who are already rabid to not just take up what we are saying and sort of convince themselves that it's true, but to be able to embrace it with the fervor that they feel for his ideology.
Do you think that helps to grow his numbers in any way, or is that just speaking over and over again to the same, what we would call his base? I'm wondering because I think
that's a good question.
Because I guess I sometimes wonder, this is both about Jones, which I think is a great example, but I also think about the president. This question about do like mass rallies really add anything to the base that's already committed, or just does it just reconfirm for the people who they would believe this no matter what the president was doing? I'm always kind of curious as to how, because I think sometimes the numerical, how many hits has something had, or that sort of stuff, are very often not very good measurements. So I guess I'm wondering whether or not you think that there's like any evidence that Alex Jones both kind of grows while also confirming the most recent conspiracy theory that he's been sold.
I think that's a great question, and I do think that maybe what we want for more influential leaders to take up our cause. So the people we'd like to see that the people who Alex Jones influences to become more influential. And we'd like to maybe help create other Alex Joneses. People who begin to be very literate in using the social media bullhorn.
But don't we also have to worry that we kind of drag the system of public discourse down by looking for people who are, like Jones? I mean, in the sense that, doesn't this just like lead us to like dumb down our own, ideas or?
I'm sorry. When I said we, I didn't mean the good guys.
Oh, okay.
I just mean if we are looking to propagate a conspiracy theory, those we's are wanting to find more Alex Joneses.
Yeah, and have we gotten to a point, I guess, in our history that Alex Joneses have now completely done away with any authority lodged in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, newspaper websites that have a high reputation? I mean, does that actually occur? That is, that the more that he gets kind of control over the information and the theories that he wants to bandy about, that we also lose control over, a public discourse that's more constructive than, because I mean, my son got interviewed by Alex Jones's thing at a protest, and he said, it was just, I mean, it was, and I've listened to Alex Jones. I mean, I can't even believe people believe this stuff. I mean, it's just so over the top. It's so uber aggressive in terms of the way it frames things that I'm like, wow, I can't see how that would appeal. But on the other hand, it seems to be appealing, and it seems to be displacing the more traditional, media outlets that would cover news for us.
Well, I think you've hit on something really important, Kevin. I think it has to do with our filter bubbles that we live in. So if we are, I think most of us don't tend to try to get information from many, many different kinds of channels. I think most of us find our comfort zone, and that's where we get our information. And we wind up, everything we find out is filtered through those places where what we consider to be credible to becoming. So, you and I are pointing ahead of PhDs. We know how to find credibility. We've been trained to do that for 30 years or whatever. So we likely are going to go to the same kinds of places to get our information. And most people who are listening to this conversation probably do something similar. So we will have the same kinds of information that come to us as fact. But the Alex Jones listeners, the people who are tuning into those kinds of conversations, are tuning into just that whole sort of silo of conversations where the same echo chambers are operating and the same filter has been applied all the way through.
Right.
We're not talking to each other. As much as we say the internet promotes diversity and social media promotes diversity and there's all this democracy, yada, yada, it's not. It's a place where we talk to people like ourselves.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. And that goes back to my general note of pessimism about recovering some sort of democratic public debate that's, constructive and, productive. So I mean, I'm in total agreement. I think that siloing of people has been an alarming thing that you can observe over the last, 20, 30 years or so.
So you both kind of go ahead. No,
I'm sorry. I was just going to say a lot of people like to romanticize this past where we all watched Walter Cronkite.
Right.
But that in itself was, that was the party line. That was journalism. That we knew what it was going to be. It was going to be the same way over there at Peter Jennings and the same way in the New York Times. Now there are a lot of different voices. Yay. But they're not being heard by everyone.
Yeah, I think that there is a definite danger in romanticizing the past. Usually I hear it around the Lincoln Douglas debates that were supposedly these long, 8-hour meetings where the two guys would argue over all sorts of details and that related to questions about slavery and all sorts of other things. And, I always say, how do we know that the people who were in attendance were actually listening to those two guys talk? How many of them were maybe swigging a beer and getting distracted by something? We just don't know. We can never know that. So I'm always mistrustful of romanticizing the past. On the other hand, I don't want to go too far in that because I think that sometimes, we were doing things in the past that maybe were better than what we're doing now. But as a general rule, I agree. Don't romanticize the past. It's way too easy to do, and you're in dangerous territory when you do it.
I think that's a great statement because, they didn't have these at the Lincoln Douglas debates, but they had their own version of it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I always tell students, just because a book was a #1 bestseller and people were putting it on their, dining room tables to show off that they were literate to their friends doesn't mean they read a single word in the damn thing, So, I mean, that's, I think, again, we are prone to thinking that the past was always much better than it probably actually was.
Yeah, that's a great point to take away, too. So going back to what you were talking about, how people, who share the similar beliefs or whatnot will talk to each other and stay within that silo. Let's talk about when they don't. This was also, yes, right. This is also a question from Facebook, and they're asking about if you can talk about the effect of people, who have this anonymous persona on social media where they don't have to deal with the face-to-face contact and conversation when having, different, political beliefs or any beliefs like that. And so, they're asking, when people don't see the effects of their actions online, the rhetoric seems to go to a place where a normal face-to-face conversation wouldn't necessarily go. Can you talk about, how that happens and how people handle that, and if it's a good, a bad thing?
Yeah, my only personal experience with that has been, as at OU, we've gone with, remote teaching. I've noticed that there are certain students who seem more willing to go into a chat room on Teams and, put forth their own argument. And those are often students who otherwise would have been quiet, would never have, said a word, would have deferred to the people who are the domineering ones in the classroom. And so I both kind of think, and I think that's a good thing. I think it gives voice to people who sometimes would otherwise have been kind of shut out of the dialogue. On the other hand, I do think there's a real danger, and I've noticed this in a lot of you just kind of check out the internet for a little while, and you pretty quickly see, the fact that the kind of going for the throat approach, and people saying things that they would not say face to face is a serious problem. The other thing that I remember having, one of my first experiences having, was publishing a book review for a journal that was online, and they allowed for the readership to make comments. And what I noticed over and over, and I think this is still the case, is that I'd look at the first comment, which was about the review. And then I'd find that the second comment was about the first comment. And then the third comment was about the second comment. And I mean, you just start to tunnel down, right? By the end of the thing, I looked at it was like 150 entries. By the end of the thing, I couldn't even tell what I had written about, right? Because it was just so completely off, and people were yelling at one another and, calling one another bad words and all this sort of stuff. And so I think the internet, is conducive to that. On the other hand, there's the good side, which is that some of the shy people might speak more often. So I'm kind of mixed about that. Again, I wouldn't romanticize, the classroom of old, but on the other hand, I do worry that we get nasty towards one another in ways that we don't even see the impacts that we're having upon other people's, well-being, so to speak.
Well, I can say that the body of scholarship is similarly of two minds. So there's something called the online disinhibition effect, which is exactly the thing that Kevin's referring to, which is we go online, and especially if we're able to be anonymous, as we are on YouTube or on Reddit, it's very easy for us to sling mud. It's very easy for us. I mean, it's sort of like getting drunk. You say what you want. It's a little bit like that, I've heard. And so the online disinhibition effect is such that, over time, the more time that you spend on social media, the more used to you become of communicating in this kind of disembodied forum, the easier it is for you to just say what you think. And sometimes that's good. And sometimes it contributes to the breakdown of civility in our discourse. And we see that happening more and more now. On the one hand, I mean, people who might be disenfranchised in a traditional situation are going to be able to express themselves more freely online. And that is a wonderful thing. That's part of the democratic promise of the internet. But it does have that limitation. There are people who are just going to be more willing to be rude than they would be face to face.
Yeah, I know I've jumped down those rabbit holes of, the comments after comments after comments that I can't believe how some people talk and comment to each other. But, if you're not seeing the face of the person that you're commenting back to, it makes it a whole lot easier to post whatever you do.
That's probably grown worse in the pandemic too, right? People have more time at home, and they're, they're going to be the number 150 commentator because they don't have anything better to do, So I mean, I think I don't study this stuff, obviously. Karen would know better than I.
You're doing well, though.
Oh, thank you. I'm doing my best. But I really do think that there's probably an uptick in that sort of siloing thing that we're talking about, and also just people going onto social media to just, say stupid things that they otherwise wouldn't have said, in part because they've got more time on their hands, I guess.
Yeah, it's this thing that's there, and all these people you're normally around, they're not there. But this one thing is, and you can go and you can express these things that well up, and you can have these conversations that can be very rewarding. And they also can be very destructive.
Yeah, I like the term civility. I think that's a term that people should think about nowadays a little bit more than they do.
Yeah. And I feel like, in the climate we're currently in, between the pandemic and, people are stressed about the election and a week now. Yeah, the term civility is something that I feel like you keep seeing less and less of, just with the stress and the different factors surrounding everyone's lives.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, we are unfortunately coming to a close of our conversation.
My goodness. I
know this hour seems like it's just flew by. This was so great talking with you both, but I did want to open the floor and leave it, up to you to provide any additional thoughts or, concluding ideas or information that you'd like to tell our viewers.
Well, I think I've covered, what I've been asked to. I have a lot more I can talk about at some other time with people who are interested. I'd love to talk with Kevin again, but I do want to mention one of the first political memes that happened, and memes being something that's really not just like the image macro that you see, but something that gets communicated virally and shared a lot of. Does anybody remember in 2007, Binders Full of Women?
Oh yeah, I remember that. My wife.
So you don't.
My wife did it as a Halloween outfit.
I was going to say, I was too young. Too young.
You're too young. But those of us of a certain age who remember when Mitt Romney was running for president, remember these kinds of things. So when things come up in political debates, as this did, it became a little catchphrase for a minute. And it had a whole lot of meaning that now, of course, has none. But Kevin and I, it still comes back, doesn't it? When you
my wife had a Halloween costume that was a bunch of binders that she wore with a friend of hers to go, out on Halloween night. So I remember that. I remember that well. That was someone who I think often said things that perhaps he should have been a little bit more careful with. But yeah, that was a funny episode in political history.
It's still my Pinterest bio photo, by the way. So.
Oh.
So my last statement then is homework. Go look up Binders Full of Women. Kevin.
I was just saying, literally after this call, that is what I'm going to do now. One, that, and then second, your Pinterest photo, apparently.
I'll say something very quickly. I'm designing a new course called The History of Now, which is going to look at very contemporary history, and it's going to end where students basically follow current events and ask the question: is the event that you're talking about going to be important in terms of once we have historical perspective on it? And trying to get them to think through, like maybe in some ways what Karen does with her students is try to get the students to think through what really is important. Just because something happened and all the news outlets are covering it, are we really going to be talking about this, 20, 30 years down the road? How can you get that kind of, and because I think that I worry about a lot of my students is that they just lack that historical perspective, and it's not their fault. I mean, because there's very little of an attempt to get to the historical perspective, but with the 24/7 cable and the internet and stuff like that, it's become, I think, even harder. So I kind of encourage people to think about ways that they can, not rely entirely upon social media, and try to maybe in some ways recreate face-to-face, even if it's virtual communication, and try to improve the levels of public discourse in this country. That's a big charge, I realize.
I want to take that class with you, Kevin.
I know, I thought the same thing. You let us know when you start that.
It's next spring.
Next spring. I'll have to put that on my calendar. That sounds extremely interesting.
Thank you very much for this. This has been a delight.
Yeah, it has. It's been wonderful.
Thank the two of you. I mean, really appreciate taking the time out of, your busy schedules. I'm sure everything has got to be tougher being online and trying to adapt to that still. I know it's been 7 or 8 months, but it's still not easy to do. So I really do appreciate you taking time out to talk with us, and especially on something extremely relevant, and I think something that is informative, especially the part talking about social media literacy and fake news and these alternative facts. It's something that, with a week left until the election, I think is even more important to spend that time doing. So again, thank you so much. And for our viewers, if you have any further questions, please send us a message or comment on this live stream, and we'll be sure to get you the questions to these experts and then get you answers. So again, thank you to you both so much. And as I always finish saying, do not forget to get out and vote before or on November 3rd.
Absolutely.
Preferably before.
Preferably before.
Agreed.
But better late than never, but November 3rd is it. All right.
Thank you very much.
Again.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you.